Claire, you're becoming an embarrassment. The words sliced through the quiet hum of our oversized stainless steel refrigerator, each one a perfectly sharpened icicle aimed directly at my heart. My husband, Eric, didn't even bother to look up from his laptop. The glow of the screen cast a sterile, bluish light on his face, carving out the sharp angles of his jaw and highlighting the deep-set concentration in his eyes. He was a man who prided himself on precision, whether in the courtroom or in the casual cruelty he dispensed at home. I had just walked into our cavernous, state-of-the-art kitchen in our beautiful Cherry Creek house, a place that looked like it had been lifted from the pages of an architectural magazine. The polished marble countertops gleamed under the recessed lighting, the sub-zero appliances were seamlessly integrated into custom cabinetry, and a massive bouquet of lilies, my favorite, sat on the island. From the outside, we were the picture of Denver society perfection, the successful corporate attorney and his brilliant senior investment advisor wife. An 18-year marriage that looked as solid and pristine as the Rocky Mountains that loomed in the distance. But inside these walls, the air was thin and cold. The words Eric had just thrown at me felt like a physical blow, knocking the wind from my lungs. The triumph of my day, the reason I was walking on air just moments ago, evaporated into a bitter mist. I had just closed a major client deal at Sundale Financial, a complex portfolio restructuring worth over $2 million. It was a career-defining moment, the culmination of months of grueling work, late nights, and navigating treacherous market waters. I had walked in the door wanting to crack open a celebratory bottle of champagne, to share the victory with the man I had spent nearly 2 decades of my life with. Instead, I was met with a criticism so casual it was profound. "What did you say?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I set my leather briefcase down on the cool floor, the soft thud echoing in the sudden, tense silence. He finally lifted his gaze, his eyes a flat, unimpressed gray. "I said you're an embarrassment. Look at this place. Look at yourself." My eyes followed his dismissive gesture. He was right, the kitchen was a mess. The morning's rush, toast crumbs, a smear of jam, 2 coffee mugs by the sink, was still on display. I had been so focused on my presentation that I had left the house in a whirlwind. Then I looked down at myself. My silk blouse was slightly wrinkled after a 12-hour day, a faint coffee stain I hadn't noticed was on the cuff, and my hair had lost some of its morning sleekness. I was a 45-year-old woman who had just commanded a boardroom, and he was making me feel like a slovenly teenager. "I had a great day at work today," I started, trying to reroute the conversation, to hold on to the last vestiges of my achievement. "The Morrison account finally." "Nobody cares about your little victories, Claire," he interrupted, his voice dripping with a disdain that was all too familiar. "Not when you can barely function as a wife." Function as a wife. The phrase was a weapon, one he had been honing for the past year. Ever since my father passed away in March after a long, brutal battle with cancer, my world had felt like it was crumbling beneath my feet. The grief was a constant, heavy shroud. My dad had been my anchor, my biggest cheerleader. Losing him felt like losing a part of my own foundation. Eric, a man who saw emotion as a transactional liability, had offered little comfort. His initial concern, which had felt performative even then, had quickly curdled into something much crueler. My evening glass of wine, once a simple pleasure, had become a way to numb the gnawing emptiness, to quiet the relentless loop of memories and what-ifs. And Eric had noticed. He watched me, not with worry, but with a clinical, detached observation, like a scientist studying a specimen. What had started as concern had morphed into a constant stream of criticism, a tool he used to chip away at my confidence, my sanity, my very sense of self. "Your best is pathetic, Claire," he said, his lips curling into a sneer. He closed his laptop with a decisive snap, the sound like a gavel falling. "You're becoming unstable. And frankly, I'm tired of covering for you." Unstable. The word hung in the air, calculated and venomous. It wasn't a word you blurted out in the heat of an argument. It was a word chosen with legal precision, a word meant to build a case. A cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. This was more than a marital spat. This was a strategy. Before I could process the chilling implication, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, a flicker of something, annoyance, crossing his face before he smoothed it back into his usual mask of control. "I need to take this," he said, standing and straightening his tie. He walked toward his home office, a sanctuary of mahogany and leather where I was rarely welcome. As he reached the doorway, he paused and looked back at me, his eyes cold and hard. "Try not to embarrass yourself further tonight." He disappeared down the hallway, his footsteps crisp and authoritative on the hardwood floors. I stood alone in the gleaming, silent kitchen, surrounded by the trappings of a perfect life that felt like an elaborate cage. I felt smaller than I had in years, the powerful woman from the boardroom reduced to a trembling mess. My hand instinctively reached for the wine bottle on the counter, the familiar crutch. But something made me stop. Maybe it was the clinical way he had said unstable. Maybe it was the cold finality in his tone. Or maybe it was just sheer, unadulterated exhaustion from the grief, the pressure, and the relentless, soul-crushing criticism. I put the bottle back. I poured myself a glass of water, my hand shaking so badly that droplets splashed onto the marble. I didn't know it then, but that simple decision, water instead of wine, was the first step on a path that would change everything. It was the moment the victim began to disappear, and the strategist began to emerge. The next morning, I woke up with a clearer head than I'd had in months. The usual fog of grief and low-grade hangover was absent, replaced by a sharp, cold clarity. Eric had already left for work, which was his norm. He was a man who lived by the billable hour, and our mornings were rarely shared. But as I made the bed, smoothing the duvet over his side, I noticed something out of place. He'd left his coffee mug on the nightstand, a small act of carelessness that was utterly out of character for him. I reached to grab it, intending to take it to the kitchen, when something small and black caught my eye. It was tucked behind the base of the heavy, modern lamp, almost perfectly concealed. My heart stopped. My breath caught in my throat. It was a voice recorder, no bigger than my thumb. A tiny red light blinked rhythmically, a malevolent, silent pulse. It was actively recording. I stared at the device for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. The silence of the house pressed in on me, suffocating. Why would Eric be recording me in our bedroom? Suddenly, every conversation we'd had recently took on a different, sinister meaning. Every time he'd goaded me into arguments, every time he'd accused me of being too emotional or irrational, every time he'd pushed me toward that wine bottle, it wasn't concern for my well-being. It was evidence gathering. My hand shook as I carefully examined the recorder without moving it from its position. He was building a case. A case against me. The word unstable echoed in my mind, no longer an insult but a legal term of art. He was a corporate attorney, but he knew divorce law. He was orchestrating my downfall. The realization that my husband was actively working to destroy me should have sent me into a spiral. It should have been the final blow that shattered my already fragile state. But instead, it lit a fire inside me, a cold, hard rage that I hadn't felt in months. For the first time since my father's death, I had clarity of purpose. Eric thought he was dealing with a broken woman who would crumble under pressure. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. I left the recorder exactly where it was and went downstairs to make breakfast, my mind racing. If Eric was secretly recording me, there had to be a reason. He was playing a long game, and I needed to understand the rules before I could figure out how to win. That evening, Eric came home with flowers, a bouquet of expensive, long-stemmed red roses. It was a gesture he hadn't made in months, and it was so transparent it was almost laughable. "I'm sorry about last night," he said, presenting them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His public persona was always flawless. "I know you're going through a rough time with your father's passing. Maybe we should talk to someone about getting you some help." There it was again. The carefully constructed narrative. language designed to establish me as the problem, the one who needed fixing. Help? I asked, my voice carefully modulated to sound wounded and confused as I arranged the flowers in a vase. Just someone to talk to, he said, his tone oozing with false concern. About the drinking, about your emotional state. I'm worried about you, Claire. I smiled and nodded, playing my part. Maybe you're right. Let me think about it. That night, as Eric worked late in his office, I heard him on a phone call. The walls in our house weren't particularly thick, and his voice, though low, carried more than he probably realized. She's getting worse, I heard him say to the person on the other end. Yesterday, she could barely hold a conversation without slurring her words. I crept closer to the office door, my heart pounding. I know, baby, he continued, and the word baby hit me like a slap. But we have to be patient. The recordings are building a solid case. By the time I file, she won't be able to claim anything. The word baby confirmed everything. Victoria. It had to be Victoria Hendricks, a junior associate at his firm. A woman I'd met briefly at the firm Christmas party, all bright-eyed ambition and a smile that seemed a little too eager. Eric was talking to another woman about me. About recordings. About filing something. I backed away from the door slowly, pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place. My husband wasn't just recording me, he was orchestrating my downfall with his mistress. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, the rage a cold, steady burn in my chest. By morning, the grief that had clouded my life for a year was gone, burned away by a singular, consuming focus. I started my day not with sorrow, but with a plan. The next morning, I called in sick to work, something I rarely did, and spent the day researching. I learned about hidden cameras, voice-activated recording devices, and digital surveillance equipment. I learned about the best investigative journalists in the Denver area, the ones who specialized in stories about abuse of power and legal manipulation. If Eric wanted to play the evidence game, I'd show him how it was really done. My first stop was an electronics store in downtown Denver. The sales clerk, a young man who looked like he knew his way around surveillance equipment, gave me a crash course in placement and retrieval. You want these where there's natural conversation, but not obvious snooping, he explained, pointing to a tiny camera disguised as a USB charger. Kitchen islands, coffee tables, anywhere people naturally gather and talk. By the time Eric came home that evening, I had transformed our house into a surveillance network. Hidden cameras in the living room and kitchen. Voice recorders in his office and car. And backup devices in locations he'd never think to check. If he was recording me, I was going to record everything. Over the next week, I maintained the appearance of the grieving, struggling wife Eric expected to see. I poured wine at dinner but barely touched it. I seemed distracted and emotional during our conversations. I played the part he needed me to play, while my devices captured every moment of his performance. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening. Eric thought I was upstairs taking a bath, but I was actually in our bedroom, listening through a repurposed baby monitor I had placed in his office. His mistress, Victoria, had come over for what Eric thought was a private meeting. This worthless drunk won't get a penny, Eric laughed, and I could hear Victoria giggling in response. She's too weak to fight back. By the time I'm done with her, she'll be lucky if she can afford a studio apartment. Are you sure the recordings will hold up in court? Victoria asked. Please. I've got hours of her slurring her words, crying, acting completely unstable. No judge is going to award alimony to an alcoholic who can't take care of herself. What about her job? She makes good money. Not for long. I've already reached out to some contacts at her firm. A few anonymous tips about her drinking problem, and they'll start questioning her judgment with client accounts. She'll be fired within a month. I listened to them plan my complete destruction with the detached fascination of someone watching a nature documentary about predators. They had no idea they were being recorded. No idea that every word of their conspiracy was being captured in crystal clear audio. That night, I knew exactly what I had to do. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to gather evidence in secret, I decided to accelerate Eric's timeline. If he wanted me to appear unstable, I'd give him exactly what he was looking for. But on my terms. I started by calling Sundale Financial and speaking with my supervisor, Helena Reynolds. "Helena, I need to take some personal time," I said, making sure to sound slightly shaky. "I'm dealing with some family issues related to my father's estate, and I think I need a few weeks to get my head straight." Helena, who had been my mentor for years, was immediately concerned. "Claire, is everything okay? You've seemed stressed lately." "I'm fine," I said, letting a slight tremor creep into my voice. "I just need some time to figure things out. Eric thinks it might be good for me, too." "Of course, take all the time you need. Your job will be here when you're ready." Perfect. Now Eric would think his plan to isolate me professionally was working. But I'd actually protected myself by proactively taking leave, rather than being fired. That evening, I staged the performance of my life. As Eric walked through the door, I was in the kitchen with a glass of wine in my hand, though it was actually grape juice mixed with water. I'd spilled some on my shirt and messed up my hair slightly. "Claire? What happened here?" Eric asked, and I could hear the barely contained excitement in his voice. "I had a bad day," I said, making sure to sound slightly slurred. "Helena thinks I need time off work. Maybe she's right. Maybe everyone's right about me." Eric moved closer, and I could practically see him calculating how this would play in divorce court. "Honey, I think you should sit down. You seem upset." "I called my sister today," I continued, improvising. "Told her about how you've been helping me deal with Dad's death. She thinks I'm lucky to have such a supportive husband." The irony wasn't lost on me, but Eric ate it up. "I just want what's best for you, Claire. Maybe we should look into some treatment options." "Treatment?" I let my voice break slightly. "You think I need treatment?" "I think you need help. And I'm going to make sure you get it." That night, after Eric went to sleep, I downloaded all the recordings from my devices and began organizing them into a comprehensive file. What I found was even worse than I'd imagined. Eric had been systematically documenting what he perceived as my failures for months, creating a narrative of decline that started well before my father's death. But more importantly, I had captured his real voice, the cruel, calculating man who laughed about destroying his wife's life with his mistress. The contrast between his public persona as a concerned husband and his private cruelty was startling. The next day, while Eric was at work, I made a phone call that would change everything. I'd researched investigative journalists in the Denver area and found Rachel Moore, who wrote for the Morning Ledger and specialized in stories about abuse of power and legal manipulation. Ms. Moore's office came the professional voice of her assistant. "I'd like to speak with Rachel Moore about a story involving legal fraud and domestic manipulation," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Can I get your name and a brief description of the situation?" "My name is Claire Beasley. My husband is a prominent attorney who's been secretly recording me and manipulating evidence to build a false case for divorce. I have recordings of him admitting to conspiracy and planning to destroy my career. I think your readers would be very interested in how the legal system can be weaponized against innocent spouses." There was a pause. "Please hold. Ms. Moore will want to speak with you directly." 2 minutes later, Rachel Moore was on the line. "Mrs. Beasley, tell me everything." Rachel Moore was everything I'd hoped for in an investigative journalist, sharp, skeptical, and absolutely relentless when she sensed a real story. We met the next day at a small cafe downtown, far from anywhere Eric might accidentally encounter us. "Before we go any further," Rachel said, pulling out a recorder of her own, I need to make it clear that anything you tell me will be verified independently. I don't publish, she said, stories. I need evidence. I have evidence, I said, sliding a USB drive across the table. Hours of audio and video recordings, financial documents showing money being moved without my knowledge, and communications between my husband and his mistress detailing their entire plan. Rachel's eyebrows raised as she pocketed the drive. This sounds almost too convenient. Why are you coming to me instead of just using this in divorce court? Because this isn't just about my divorce, I said. Eric isn't the only attorney who's figured out how to game the system. He's told Victoria about other cases where he's used similar tactics. This is a pattern of behavior that goes beyond just one marriage. Victoria is the mistress? Victoria Hendricks. She's an associate at his firm, Brown Cove Holdings Legal Division. According to my recordings, she's been helping him research ways to manipulate evidence in divorce proceedings. They've discussed at least 3 other cases where similar tactics were used. Rachel was taking notes furiously. What kind of timeline are we looking at? When is he planning to file? Based on what I've overheard, he's waiting for one more incident that will cement his case. He wants me to have some kind of public breakdown or do something that will make his allegations seem credible. And you're not going to give him that? No. I'm going to give him something much worse. I'm going to give him the truth. Over the next week, Rachel worked with incredible efficiency. She verified my recordings with audio experts, cross-referenced the financial documents with public records, and even managed to interview 2 other women who had gone through divorces with attorneys from Eric's firm under suspicious circumstances. Meanwhile, I continued playing my part at home. Eric's behavior had become increasingly bold. He no longer bothered to hide his contempt for me, probably because he thought I was too broken to notice or remember clearly. On Wednesday evening, he brought Victoria to our house for dinner. The audacity of it took my breath away, but I maintained my composure. "Claire, you remember Victoria from the firm Christmas party last year?" Eric said, as if this was a perfectly normal social visit. "Of course," I said, shaking Victoria's hand and noting how she avoided eye contact. "It's so nice of you to come check on me. Eric's told you about my rough patch, I'm sure." Victoria glanced at Eric nervously. "He mentioned you've been going through a difficult time." "Oh, yes. Very difficult. Sometimes I feel like my whole world is falling apart, and I don't even know why." I let my voice carry just the right amount of fragility. It's like someone is systematically destroying everything I care about, and I'm too stupid to understand how. The irony was delicious. Victoria actually squirmed in her chair. During dinner, they became increasingly relaxed, probably assuming I was too damaged to pick up on their subtle communications and inside jokes. What they didn't know was that every word was being recorded by 3 different devices I had strategically placed throughout the dining room. "You know what," Eric said as Victoria was leaving, "I think Claire's finally starting to understand that she needs help. Sometimes people have to hit rock bottom before they can accept reality." "That's so true," Victoria agreed. "Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is stop enabling someone's destructive behavior." After she left, Eric turned to me with what I'm sure he thought was a compassionate expression. "Claire, I think it's time we had a serious conversation about getting you some professional help." "You're probably right," I said. "Maybe it's time I face the truth about my situation." I wasn't lying. It was definitely time for the truth. Rachel called me Friday morning with news that made my heart race. "We're ready to publish Sunday. The editors have reviewed everything, our legal team has cleared it, and we've got enough corroboration to make this bulletproof." "Are you prepared for what comes next?" "What do you mean?" I asked, though I had a pretty good idea. "Once the story breaks, your life is going to change dramatically. Eric will know you've been investigating him, his firm will likely face scrutiny, and you'll be in the middle of a very public scandal. Are you ready for that level of attention? I thought about the woman I'd been a month ago, grieving, isolated, questioning my own sanity as my husband systematically tore down my self-worth. Then I thought about the woman I was now, clear-headed, strategic, and absolutely done with being anyone's victim. I'm ready, I said. But I want to be prepared. What's the headline going to be? Local attorney caught on recording planning to frame wife as alcoholic in divorce scheme. We've got sidebar stories about the other cases and an editorial about legal ethics reform. This is going to be front page, above the fold. That weekend was surreal. Eric was in an unusually good mood, probably because he thought his plan was nearing completion. He even suggested we go out to dinner Saturday night, something we hadn't done in months. You seem like you're feeling better, he said over dinner at an expensive restaurant downtown. More like your old self. I think I'm finally accepting reality, I said, which was probably the most honest thing I'd said to him in weeks. That's all anyone can ask for. Sometimes the people who love us see things we can't see about ourselves. The sincerity in his voice was almost impressive. If I hadn't heard the recordings of him laughing about destroying me, I might have actually believed he cared. Sunday morning arrived with unusual quiet. Eric was sleeping in, which was rare for him, and I was up early making coffee when my phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. It's live. Check the Morning Ledger website. I opened my laptop, and there it was. My story. Splashed across the front page of Denver's most widely read newspaper. The headline was even more damning than Rachel had described. Prominent attorney secretly recorded wife, planned false alcoholism claims in divorce conspiracy. The article was devastating. Rachel had woven together the audio recordings, financial evidence, and expert commentary into a narrative that painted Eric not as a concerned husband, but as a manipulative predator who had weaponized the legal system against his own wife. The recordings of him laughing with Victoria about my supposed weakness were particularly damning. But what really made my heart sing was the sidebar story about the other women. Rachel had found not just 2, but 4 other cases where Eric's firm had used similar tactics. The paper was calling for an investigation into the entire practice. 2 other women had come forward with similar stories about Eric's firm. Victoria had been placed on leave as well, and according to Rachel, she was already looking for a new job outside of Denver. I heard Eric's alarm go off upstairs, and I quickly closed the laptop. Within minutes, his phone started ringing. What the hell? I heard him shouting from the bedroom. How did they get this? Who gave them these recordings? His footsteps thundered down the stairs as I calmly sipped my coffee. Eric appeared in the kitchen, still in his pajamas, holding his phone with a look of absolute panic. Claire, he said, his voice carefully controlled. We need to talk. Good morning to you, too, honey, I said pleasantly. You seem upset. Bad news? He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the exact moment when he realized that the broken woman he'd been manipulating no longer existed. You did this, he said quietly. Did what? I asked, meeting his gaze steadily. I'm just a worthless drunk, remember? Too weak to fight back? The next few hours unfolded exactly as I had hoped they would. Eric's phone didn't stop ringing. Calls from his law firm, reporters, family members who had seen the story, and presumably Victoria, though he wasn't taking those calls in front of me anymore. You recorded me? He said, pacing around our kitchen like a caged animal. You've been recording me this entire time? Interesting choice of words, I said calmly. Almost like you're familiar with the concept of secret recordings. This is different. What I was doing was what, Eric? Justified? Legal? Necessary? I stood up and faced him directly. You hid recording devices in our bedroom. You conspired with your mistress to destroy my career. You planned to take everything I've worked for and leave me with nothing. So please, explain to me how what I did was different. For the first time in months, Eric had no response. The man who had made his living crafting arguments and manipulating language was speechless. My phone rang, and I answered it without taking my eyes off Eric. Hello? Mrs. Beasley? This is Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. We'd like to interview you about the Morning Ledger story. Would you be available today? I'd be happy to tell my story, I said, loudly enough for Eric to hear. Let me check my schedule and get back to you. As I hung up, Eric's face had gone completely white. Claire, think about what you're doing. If this goes any further, it's going to destroy both of us. You already destroyed us, Eric. I'm just making sure the truth comes out. His phone buzzed with a text, and I watched his face crumble as he read it. My firm is placing me on administrative leave pending an investigation, he said quietly. That's unfortunate, I replied. I suppose they don't appreciate attorneys who commit fraud and conspiracy. Who would have thought? You don't understand what you've done. My career. Your career built on lies and manipulation? Yes, I think I understand perfectly. By Tuesday, the story had taken on a life of its own. The Colorado Bar Association announced they were opening an ethics investigation. I, meanwhile, had become something of a folk hero. My inbox was flooded with messages from women who had gone through similar experiences. Divorce attorneys were offering to represent me, and reporters were wanting to interview me about domestic manipulation and legal abuse. The irony wasn't lost on me that Eric's plan to isolate and destroy me had instead connected me with a community of people who understood exactly what I had been through. Wednesday afternoon, Eric came home to find me packing boxes in his office. What are you doing? He asked. Packing your things. I filed for divorce this morning, and my attorney advised me to document all marital assets before you try to hide them. I held up a financial statement. Speaking of which, I found the account where you've been transferring our joint savings. Very thorough of you to leave such a clear paper trail. Claire, we can work this out. We don't need lawyers. Actually, we do. See, unlike you, I'm going to do this the legal way. No secret recordings, no manipulation, no conspiracy. Just facts and evidence presented in open court. Eric sank into a chair, looking more defeated than I'd ever seen him. What do you want? I want what I've always wanted, Eric. I want respect, I want honesty, and I want justice. I closed the box I was packing and looked at him directly. The difference is, now I'm going to get all three. The man who had once called me too weak to fight back was finally learning just how strong I really was. 6 months later, as I sat in my new apartment overlooking downtown Denver, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The divorce had been finalized in my favor. Eric's legal career was effectively over, and I had returned to work at Sundale Financial with a promotion and the respect of my colleagues. My revenge hadn't been about destruction. It had been about truth. And truth had set me free in ways I never could have imagined.